I hope everybody is feeling well fed and ready for a very, very packed afternoon. Once again, I'm Margaret Lowe-Smith. I'm president of Atlantic Live. Thank you. And to keep you in your seats all afternoon, I just want to sort of foreshadow the end of the day ends with a cocktail party, or I should say an after party. Before we get rolling, I want to once again thank our underwriters for making the Atlantic's first LGBT Summit Unfinished Business possible. That's the American Federation of Teachers, the Arcus Foundation, Deloitte, Gilead Sciences, and PG&E. We're going to get rolling this afternoon right away and consider the intersection of activist movements, how they interact, inspire, and at times collide, in a session we're calling The Power of the People. I'd like to introduce Hayden Mora. She's founder and principal of the Parallax Group, a trans-led consulting firm, and Yoruba Richen is a filmmaker whose most recent movie is The New Black. And the Atlantic's Matt Thompson is here to lead the conversation. Take it away, Matt.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that intro, Margaret. I have been speaking a little bit, chatting a little bit with our two panelists here today, and this conversation could be 12 hours. So prep your quickest questions now, because I'm sure that you're going to have them. Just a couple of more context, some more context on our panelists. Hayden, in addition to now leading his own consultancy, the Parallax Group that he founded, previously served as a senior exec at HRC, the first ever trans person on the senior executive team at HRC, and before that was at SEIU, and Yoruba Richen, who, in addition to having directed two acclaimed documentaries, The Promised Land and The New Black, serves as the director of the documentary program at the CUNY School of Journalism. So thank you for coming with us today.
Thank you.
Before I started talking with you all, I was thinking that I wanted to talk about activism and movement building, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But what was sticking out in the conversations that we had was about whose stories get told in movements and who is telling the stories. Yoruba, you've recently directed and have been on the road with a documentary that premiered at the LA Film Festival, I believe. The New Black, about the intersection of the marriage equality movement and African America. And I'm curious, what was the journey like? You were involved previously with a film called Brother to Brother, which I remember watching and really enjoying. It was a fantastic movie. What was the journey like from that movie to premiering The New Black? How did the conversation change?
Wow. So thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here.
And so Brother to Brother, the first film that you mentioned, where I was associate producer on, and that was a fiction film. It premiered at Sundance in 2004. And what I remember about being at that screening and the other screenings is the real hunger for representation and stories, complex stories that featured Black LGBT characters. Brother to Brother dealt with history, dealt with some history as well, and that history that people didn't know. And so you say what's changed. I guess I'll first talk about what stayed the same. What I experienced in showing The New Black, and we premiered at LA Film Festival and did screenings all around the world, and then was on PBS, is that there still is that hunger for those kinds of stories. And this was a documentary. Yeah. But the way in which, African American community and the LGBT community had been sort of pitted against each other after Proposition 8, which is actually what my motivation for making this film, really didn't show the complexity of this issue and how the African American community was grappling with this issue in light of the marriage equality movement and this sort of struggle over the legacy of civil rights. So that's what I was trying to show. Yeah. And I think there was a real hunger for it. Now, and of course, the politics changed so much. When I premiered in 2013, even making that film over 3 years, things had so shifted in terms of the conversations we were having, the politics, and of course, marriage equality became law of the land a year later. So things shifted and changed, and things stayed the same as well.
Yeah. Hayden, you were at So, I mean, one of the interesting dimensions of LGBTQ activism particularly over the past decade, but I mean, going back a ways, has been this ongoing struggle. I'm going to move a little bit closer.
Yeah,
I feel like
you feel a
there's
little
this
far.
12 feet of couch in between me and you. But has been this ongoing battle over sort of what's up first, what's up next, who's up next, what issue do we put before, in front of, at the forefront of activist movements? Where do we shuttle resources? And you were at HRC at a time when the organization was, of course, criticized
Was there ever
by
not a
many.
time? Yes.
Was there ever not a time? Is there ever not a time? But when the organization was criticized by many for where it chose to place the emphasis. And I'm curious what it was like, what you drew from that time, and also what led you to start your own group, the Parallax group.
You talked about the couch. I have this coffee. I'm so afraid I'm going to spill it on your beautiful white couch.
You know what?
And the Atlantic will never have trans people back, so I just want to make sure.
It's
The
leather,
burden of
it'll live.
representation is profound. But, when you were chatting about, erasure and this idea of sort of who's first, to very quickly, I grew up in East Boston, Mass. How many folks in the crowd have ever been to East Boston? Yes, somebody? Okay. Yeah, it's mostly, East Boston is one of those places as a hub. There's Logan Airport. People move through it. Tremendously powerful people move through it. It's also a very poor community, an immigrant community, and we actually used to have this. There was a big sign that said, East Boston, people live here. And I say that to say it was a collective experience of erasure, right? As if, it didn't exist, and yet on the edges of people with power passing through. And, it's one thing. The second thing is, the only thing that stays the same about Eastie is that it stays poor. The immigrant groups change. So it was a place where, my dad was a bookie, my mom was a bartender. We had very little, but it was an incredibly diverse community. And I remember being struck by the fact that all of us were poor. All of our parents worked incredibly hard, and all of them were afraid all the time. But home was also the place where I learned my first racial slurs, where my family hated my friend's family. And I just thought, there's something wrong here. I don't understand. We're all, we have this sort of shared challenge and these shared interests. So what is this division? Of course, I was 11, so I didn't have language for it. But I was very lucky. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I spent time in Chiapas and got, access to thinking about politics. And, the fundamental thing that makes me feel hopeful, and I'll talk about HRC, is that at the end of the day, there are more of us that stand to benefit from changing things than keeping the same. And the reason I spent 11 years in the labor movement is the labor movement at its best is an organizing model that teaches us to unlearn the things that get in the way of us realizing that collective power, racism, xenophobia, transphobia, misogyny, and it allows us to realize that. I didn't come out as trans until I was in my 30s because I'd never met trans people. And I came out as trans, I thought, well, where could I make a difference? Where can I take what I've learned from the labor movement and apply it? I spent a little bit of time doing some work in labor on trans issues, and I thought labor was embattled. I managed a $50 million budget, and when I went out and I spent time in the community, I was blown away by the 41% of trans folks attempt suicide. When I first learned those numbers, I thought they were daunting and high. As I got closer and learned people's real lives, I thought they were a testament to resilience. So I went to HRC because I thought, this is a place where my relative privilege, it's hard for me to be in the 1%, but coming in as trans did it. I just had to lower the bar. And here's the two things I'll say about HRC. I mean, I think HRC was at the forefront of leading a battle around the expansion of formal legal equality. Yeah. And in many ways, we've won. There's still work to do, but we've won on that fight. And yet today, in the day of protease inhibitors and PrEP, HIV and AIDS rates are continuing to climb in the most marginalized communities. Trans women of color are unsafe on the streets. And so what we've learned is, there's this extension of formal equality, but we haven't helped the folks that are most vulnerable. I came to HRC to see how I could shift or how I could change that. I think I'll talk about my greatest failure there. I think I made tactical adjustments, but, there's that moment where people were looking at marriage as this bright, shiny object, right? They had our interest, they were excited about it. And we didn't do the work of bringing those people along on the fights that are ahead, on trans issues, on POC issues, et cetera. And so I think that was my greatest failure as an advocate at HRC. But what I'd say, and I'd say to people in this room, is we have this moment now, right? We have this moment where as a community, we're figuring out, for some people what's next, for some of us, what's we're in the very beginning of things. I think journalists in this room and people in this room have an opportunity to tell the stories of trans folks and tell the story of the most marginalized in the community and to organize our work around that. And that gives us a different opportunity than I think we've had.
I need to flip the order a second and follow up with you real quick, and then come back to you, Yoruba. Very recently, we saw a case study in Houston of an activism effort around the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance, where, again, a struggle enacted itself about how do we bring in fill the largest coalition possible? What story do we tell? Is it we're just like you, or is it we are people and we have rights? How do you tell that story? What did you take away from that struggle and its outcome?
Yeah, and this is a conversation, and people in this room, funders, journalists, others, what we take from this story will matter tremendously for the folks that are most vulnerable in our community. So there's 3 things I want to say. One is that, Houston, where they rolled back civil rights, it was one of the most vicious campaigns, that I've ever seen. They compared trans people to sexual predators. Well, not compared, they said trans people are sexual predators. And what I want to say is that we were completely unprepared as a movement to fight that fight. Our victories in the trans community, number one, for the last 10 or 15 years, have been behind the scenes policy changes in matters of litigation. That's how we've won. So we've erected this patchwork across the country of protections and supports. But we've done it in a way that means that we don't, as a movement, have the infrastructure needed to fight battles like Houston. And Houston is just the beginning. The opposition has found trans issues. It's an opportunity to, just as they used same-sex marriage in the past, it's an opportunity for them to raise money and to demonize a small minority of people. And in the trans community, we have excellent legal infrastructure. We have incredible policy infrastructure. We simply don't have the political infrastructure to fight these fights. And we've got to change it. We've got to change it quickly. And the second thing is we've got to invest in leadership pipelines so that the most marginalized folks in our communities are a part of those struggles. And so, trans folks of color, in states are working on survival issues right now, right? They're still trying to, help get through the next day, trying to literally help people survive. And, what that means is funders, journalists, others, we need to create pipelines to get folks not just to develop an infrastructure for the trans community around politics, but to help the most marginalized actually be at the front so that our voices are heard. And the last thing that I'll say on Houston is, so 1, we've got to develop the infrastructure. 2, we've got to invest in leadership. And 3 is we've got to be unafraid to tell our stories. We have a tremendous amount of, we lost on marriage for 30 plus years, right? We didn't start winning until 2012. We finally had the courage to begin telling the stories of LGBT people's lives. And then we won 3 out of the 4 of the fights. We've got to be unafraid to tell trans lives and trans narratives, and we've got to get up in front on that. So we've got to build the infrastructure, we've got to develop leadership, and we've got to tell stories. And frankly, people in this room, you're a part of whether we're going to do that or not, how quickly we'll do it, and how you answer that question will have dramatic consequences for the folks that are struggling the most right now. So I'd ask you to think about those pieces.
Yoruba, I'm going to ask you a question, both as a filmmaker and as a professor of journalism. We were talking a little bit about one of my favorite films in the world, Paris is Burning, a documentary that dove into a community, a fascinating community with tons of stories in it in New York at this very particular moment. That movie was not, it had a very mixed reception in the community that it was about. And part of that centered on the identity of the teller, who was a woman. This is a movie primarily about a community of color. The filmmaker was a white woman whose gender identity was sort of more within the spectrum of familiar depictions of gender identity than many of the people that she was depicting. And I'm curious what you take away as a filmmaker, as someone who instructs students on telling stories about communities where experiences and identities may be very different from theirs, and as someone who tells those stories yourself. What do you take away from that?
Well, it's not just Paris is Burning. I mean, that's certainly one of the most visible examples. And we talked about a recent dust up, again, when it was shown in Brooklyn this summer, and none of the people from the community were invited to be a part of the screening. And that was just, 20 years of the community feeling, that they weren't getting anything out of, this film that had made the filmmaker very, very well known. But I think, this really shines a light on a larger issue around, we're having it for the first time in sort of the Hollywood realm around representation, gender representation. The race part of that is still kind of second fiddle. But we also need to have that in terms of the documentary world. It's a bit better, but there still is a phenomenon of people of color not being able to tell their own stories and not having that access. And quite frankly, having white filmmakers do that and get the funding, get the broadcasts in a way that we don't. And of course that breeds resentment when that happens, and even for a great film like Paris is Burning, because it's really about the structures that need to change. I just read an article about Jill Soloway, the creator of Transparent, and it was in the Times, and she said that on her set, she has an affirmative action policy for trans people. She said she prioritizes hiring them in all levels. She teaches workshops where she, on writing, and then has hired people from there. And I thought that was so amazing. And yet we have not done that for people of color or for women, where we explicitly say this is an affirmative action policy for people to work on this film, to people to work in this industry. And it's not just, the internships and the trainings, but then we were going to hire them and teach them so they can be in this industry. So we have a real problem. And I think the first part of it is that we have to acknowledge it and we have to talk about it. And with my students, I really, I'm not saying that people from other communities can't tell stories in that's not from their community, but how does that work? Who do you have on your team that's reflective of that community? How is this film working to advance the needs and causes of that community? How is this film being useful to the community that you're in? And you have to think about all those things, I think, when you take on such a project.
It's complicated work. I want to hear a couple of questions. We have maybe time for 2 if they're lightning sharp. All right.
No, I'm here.
Oh, we've got one from Ruby, I think.
Oh, hey, Ruby.
Hi. Well, I'm a fan of Hayden, and nice to meet you as well.
Hi.
My question is this: what do you think it's next on trans issues? We heard earlier at lunch that people need to tell their own narratives. I come from a background when sometimes I couldn't tell my own narrative because I could not get in the room. And there were other people who told my narrative, and I was okay with it because otherwise I would have disappeared. How can we help, in lack of or the presence of trans people in settings where you do have access? Yeah. There are people who have access to power every day. And I, as a trans woman of color, will never have access to that. How can you do that so the resources that you talked about, the help, finally gets to me?
I'm transitioning into privilege as a white man. I'm going to let her go first.
Well, the thing is, I think we have to also look that we're at, they call it the trans tipping point. I don't know if that's like a great phrase. But the fact is there's a lot of attention being brought to the LGBT issues, to the trans issues. So even the example I said of Jill Soloway, who is doing an affirmative action program for trans people to train them to tell their own stories, to be part of this, it's taking advantage of those opportunities and really exploiting. As a black woman, I've always felt, we know what the structures are that are, working against me, but I need to exploit what the opportunities are, because people, where are those cracks in the system that I can, through funding, through, through broadcast, whatever it is, how can I get the stories that I want told out there? And I think it's really, hooking up with people who can help you get there. It's figuring out what you want to do and how you want to tell your story and going for it.
I want to say two quick things. I know we're at time, but the first is, I think there are solutions that are working, and I do want to say, I talked about sort of the organizing at the top, where we expand formal equality and it helps the folks that have the most, right? And you see who it leaves behind. If we organize with the most vulnerable, it helps everyone. So Casa Ruby is an example of a practical solution that works, and although it helps the most vulnerable, so generally trans, gender nonconforming, people of color, right, who are at the very margins that we're talking about. It changes their lives, but it changes their lives for everybody else too, because it's a place where lesbian, gay, bisexual folks. So, Ruby is an example. There are others around the country, a trans woman of color who has created a solution. We need to invest in supporting those, but also make them replicable. The second thing I want to say, and I promise I'll close, is what happened in Houston is just the beginning. I want to say very clearly that this next 12 to 18 months, we're going to see a very different way in which trans issues are talked about. So we have this moment of, Caitlyn Jenner and Laverne Cox. We have this, but at the same time, trans women of color are being murdered, right? Trans kids are sleeping homeless on the street. The right wing in this country is going to exploit and to use this, and the next 12 to 18 months are going to be a series of public battles on trans issues, which they will use to demonize the most marginalized in our community. And we have the opportunity, you in this room, more than me, have the opportunity to figure out how we will meet those challenges. And we've got to do it head on, and we've got to build the infrastructure in the trans community. We've got to get of politics, messaging, of telling our stories. We've got to invest in leadership development. So while we have the brick and mortar of helping the most vulnerable, we've got to get folks like Ruby's voices into this mix on politics. And we need to be ready to have these fights in the States, because else it's going to dismantle all of the protections that we have, and it's going to set us back 30 years as a movement. And folks in this room, you have a chance to do something about that.
Hayden and Yoruba, thank you so much. Hayden, enjoy and use wisely your newfound white male privilege. Yoruba, thank you so much.
You.
I plan to. I'll follow you.
Yeah.